Hi, welcome back. This is part 7 of the top-down, center-out video series, and today we're talking about the guidance that top-down, center-out gives us for how to prepare the toile and then the decisions that we need to make as we're constructing it. This will set us up so that we are all set for fitting, which I'll cover in the next video. So let's get started. Here's where we left off last time. I've started with a size 12 because I determined that was my hip size in the example that we're using. And I added fabric to the top and the sides of those pattern pieces. So I'll use what you see here in this diagram to cut out my toile fabric. Once I've done that, I will do a few things before I sew it together. First, I double check that I've transferred all of my notches from the pattern onto my toile fabric. Second, I take a pen and I transfer the location of the darts or the pleats, and I draw that onto my toile fabric. And this is going to help me if I need to reposition those shaping elements at any point during fitting. This example has darts, so for a dart, I will typically trace the center line of that dart, so that'll help me if I need to adjust the intake. I can just pinch along that center line in my toile. I will typically also trace the dart legs as well, because that helps me when I'm sewing the toile together. Next, I will transfer the outline of the original size 12, in this case, pattern piece onto my toile fabric. So I will draw in the boundary of that original pattern piece so that I can use it as a reference when I'm fitting. Once I've transferred all of those markings to my fabric pieces, it's time to construct my toile. Top Down, Center Out recommends some tips for how to do this, but you can use whatever construction techniques you like. It's really up to you, and use whatever works best for you. Personally, I will baste my darts or pleats closed first, and then I'll sew my vertical seams. If you want to sew your vertical seams without using pins, Top Down, Center Out has a tip for how to do that. And to show you, I'm going to remove the extra markings on our toile pieces here for just a second, so it's a little easier to see. So I've aligned the front and back pieces by the inseam notches. That's where the arrow is here. And I'm going to sew a short line of stitches at the notch in the seam line for this pattern. So just maybe like 1 inch long of stitching. And this anchors the front and the back pattern pieces together securely at the notch. Now, once you've done that, you can then sew a line of stitches from the hem up to the notch, and then from the notch to the crotch point. And sewing in 2 passes is helpful for me if I need to stretch the back inseam, if the pattern calls for that. If not, you can also sew this in 1 pass. That's totally fine. And of course, I'm using the seam allowance here that is called for in the pattern. You can use the same technique to construct the side seam as well. So let's talk about the side seam for a minute, because you have a lot of options here. I'm going to align these pieces by the side seam so we can walk through them. First, I would strongly recommend basting your side seam, because it is virtually guaranteed you're going to need to readjust the position of the seam as you're fitting. You can baste the side seam closed from the hem notch all the way up to the waist, as shown here with these arrows, the same way you would with the final garment. Alternatively, you could also baste the side seam closed from the hem up to the hip only and stop there. If you do that, then you'll be pinning the rest of this seam closed once the toile's on your body. Some people find this is easier, so it's really up to you. Next, I've seen a lot of folks ask what seam allowance to use for the side seam, because we've added this extra fabric to the side. How do I handle that? Well, I'm going to show you just the front piece for a second, because that sort of simplifies the diagram a little bit. Now, the bottom line is that the seam allowance for the side seam is really up to you. So you should do whatever is easiest for you to sew and whatever is easiest for you to work with when you're fitting your toile. Think of the side seam stitches as merely a placeholder for now. They are really just there to close that side of the toile so you can get it on your body and start adjusting. I find personally that it's easiest for me to sew the seam line that corresponds to the original pattern piece. So in this case, I would sew my side seam along the seam line for the size 12 side seam. So when I'm sewing that, I will essentially just use this outline that I've drawn on my toile and also 5/8 or whatever the pattern seam allowance is inward from that. And that'll look like this. So my seam allowances here are just very, very wide. They're like 1 inch, 2 inches wide, and that's fine. I find for me personally, this is easiest to work with because then I've got a starting point that is the intended design and I can work from there. But that's just one approach. The other approach here would be to choose your own seam allowance for the side seam. Remember, this seam is just a placeholder for right now. It's just getting that toile on your body. So if it's easier for you to sew, then you could choose your own seam allowance. Say, arbitrarily, I'm gonna choose 5/8 away from the edge. As long as that seam allowance is consistent and parallel to the edge from top to bottom, that's fine. You would then assume that once you got that toile on your body, you would readjust that seam to try and achieve the design intent of the original pattern. So again, it's up to you and whatever you find is easiest to sew and to work with when you're fitting. Now, when you're done with your vertical seams, you will press them open. And then very, very important, you want to stay stitch the crotch seam using the pattern's seam allowance. So use a short stitch length and take care not to stretch the fabric as you're sewing this. We do this because the stay stitching will help to stabilize this edge of the toile, and it also creates a visual reference for where the center front and center back is on the toile, and that's essential for fitting because we need to align that to our center front and center back. And the last step is to hem the toile. We don't want the pant leg to be touching or resting on the floor because this can affect how the fabric hangs and drapes through the leg. Obviously, that's fine in the final garment, but for fitting, we want to be able to see what the fit is without any other interference for that fabric. So we hem the toile to get it up off the floor. And that's it. Now we're ready to fit. In my next video, it's all about fitting. So I'll walk through the guidance that Top Down Center Out gives us for how to fit the toiles that we've just constructed. It's going to be a lot of fun, so join me then, and happy sewing. I'll see you next time.